passed away 2 years ago or a year and a half ago at 100 years old. And she was not a person of much pride or many words. She was a very pious person, dignified, but there is a grace in silence. And she didn't really ever say, I love you, until after my cousin, her first grandson, was murdered. But we never felt unloved, because love is an action, love is a verb, not a saying, not a feeling. And so the way that I experience love in witnessing my mom is the way that she built and committed to community, even when community or community members didn't necessarily want to commit to her, which is something that leaders like the Kings really understood, that love is not a tit for tat, or it's not about the validation or even the acceptance, and how that carries through. So I did grow up around a lot of people, but also around a lot of images of people that I didn't know. Most people, I imagine, grew up in places where the pictures on the walls were of family members, ancestors, loved ones, whereas most of mine were artworks by other people. And so windows into other people's worlds. And the desire for my mother and others to preserve those windows, especially because seeing the world through the eyes of people of African descent is still so rare, but was extraordinarily rare then, gave me the primary perspective of the alternate lenses.
And oriented you towards a critical tactic of seeing and an expanded way of seeing the world. You spoke earlier in my class, Vision and Justice, with the students about the force of beauty and love. I want to speak about beauty, but before we go past this discussion about love, I want to maybe cue up the next slide.
But can you read this quote? Also, yeah, that's a good slide to go on too, the love over rules.
Love over rules. It's coming up next, yes, there.
This is a quote from Martin Luther King that I have been thinking a lot about, that many of you may have heard.
And so he's asking me to read, so I will, okay. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power, at its best, is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice, at its best, is power correcting everything that stands against love. Martin Luther King, Jr.
And so one of the things that I found profound about his work is not only the elegance, but the kind of rigor in which he spoke about love, the way that, at least in my growing up, he was McDonaldified. It was Mick Martin Luther King. Kind of take away some of the fact that in the context of people threatening his family, him being assassinated, loved ones and friends being assassinated, people, an incredible amount of adversity just to be able to live safely in your one society and protect your family. This commitment to love in a way, and that is not anemic, that is also stands, wait, what's the last line? Love at its best is, justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. In the school, in this place, in this building where power is, I would say, the most important thing, I'm not quite sure how much love is actually imbued in the theological, no, I mean, not theological, but in the, oh my God, I'm so tired.
He's been doing, he
I have
flew
a
so early
2-year-old
from
and
my
I can't
class.
find,
He does.
I can do like 4-letter words. What
He's
word
being
about
way too modest.
pedagogical? Goodness
Pedagogical.
gracious. Like, where's love and pedagogy when it comes to education, when it comes to governing, when it comes to, like, it's strange that we're all here because of love, but there isn't a serious study of it.
One of the functions of the artist as a political actor is to interrogate, I think to ask questions that politicians wouldn't dare, right? This goes back to, I think, the origins of what brings us together and thinking about the connection of art and justice, and that is Frederick Douglass, another leader in this conversation, who really understood, the power of the image to, at a time during the Civil War when he gave a speech about pictures, when no one thought that should be the topic, when he argued that images could give us the critical imagination to question power, to actually critique what was in front of us. So he began and created the headwaters of this larger idea about, as Tenzin stated, the second definition of visual culture, representation as a political tool, a way to remind us of what representational democracy should be about, which is at root to honor each other, to ensure that everyone counts and everyone belongs, which is another way of saying that everyone is loved, right? That everyone is part of the beloved community. These are, in a way, proxies for the term we never say in the political arena, but you do explicitly, which brings us back to love over rules. This image that I would say is, in effect, a mission statement for your practice. Can you tell those gathered and on the live stream the origins of this multifaceted idea and term, love over rules?
Sure. So I mentioned my cousin, Sunga Thomas Willis, who was murdered, and some of his parting words that were like, he was shot and killed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I have done a lot of work. I inherited a responsibility with his legacy because he was much more charismatic. Some might say better looking.
You see how modest he is.
No, I mean, these were like, sadly, these were objective truths that like he was good at everything I wasn't, and like that was my counter identity, like the not good at one stuff, which he challenged in me, that how other people's perception of me would shape me. But one of the last things there was a recording of him that a friend of his left us after he was killed, and one of the last things he said on that recording was "love over rules," and I have used that. It's become my muse and also a mission statement, because there is a connection. You cannot love passively. You can love inherently and implicitly, but you can't actually love passively. It is actually something that you can only do when we are awake, right? And there are moments. The hardest person for me to love is myself. The hardest person for me to show grace to and care to is myself. And if I'm not doing that for every moment, how much can I actually offer another person, and especially another person who I see myself as different from? So the practice of love over rules for me is it's a practice of it's internal work that is, it's the road to progress is always under construction. I'm always reinventing opportunities to love myself. And I was sharing today to your class that who I up until recently thought was myself was actually the opposite. So that you with that gesture became a part of me. You with your hand on your heart is me. And I with whatever we are you. And if that is something that a lot of, I think, lasting people in the world, people whose stories last, like Ida B. Wells there, but even I think what Frederick Douglass attempted to do with even his image was to be, for when people saw it, when you said, I remember, he's like the longest living African American. He is the most photographed person in the 19th century other than Queen Victoria. And it wasn't I don't believe that it was his ego that was creating that image. It was for others who didn't feel that they could love themselves to see themselves as dignified as being able to overcome extraordinary adversity and to be important. And so how I represent, and I see that in even some celebrities who I want to critique, but I'm also even with Beyonce, I'm like, wow, you really love me. Because your reflection is so powerful and it comes with a sacrifice. And so I tend to approach the world through cynically optimistic perspective, but that is hopefully has multiple lenses.
Yeah. Well, and like Frederick Douglass, whose force and animating principle behind becoming the most photographed American man in the 19th century, absolutely, was to commit to love as an action, right? To not just speak about it, but to actually embody it. Love for all of us in terms of shifting our notion of who counts and who belongs through the image. You too have lived out art as an action, not only through your own practice, which we'll speak about more in terms of other series and bodies of work, but through the creation of a collective to embrace us all. By that I mean the first artist-founded super PAC in the United States for freedoms, right? You said earlier in Vision and Justice in my class that you care about the we, about the embrace. Can you talk to us about the impetus behind this first ever artist-run super PAC?
Yeah, well, we often need to visualize something in order for it to become real, or to see it, to see an example of it. And we don't have very many examples in the 21st century, other than Donald Trump, of creative people being head of state, and he is extraordinarily creative. I believe that there are other creative people that might be able to create another world. And I think it's daring to be like, I know this is what you see, but this is my reality, and let's live in it. And so many people that I relate to as artists are like too busy kind of trying to keep their beautiful world in their corners, while other people are like making the world how they want to see it. Yeah. And so I took a lot of inspiration from somebody like Donald Trump, who was just like, this is the world. And believe that both him and Barack Obama were really incredible products of branding. That Barack Obama elected the posters hope and change, and like, if you don't have hope, you're probably dead, and if change is inevitable, but those meant something. Or Donald Trump said, make America great again, when and it was somehow more meaningful when he said it, but not when Ronald Reagan said it, or when George Bush the first said it, or Bill Clinton, or George Bush the second said it. That this statement, which is also pretty empty, is colored and shaped by whoever says it. And so when my question and our prompt with artists was to like, what statements do you want to put into the world that hopefully will also challenge the vision or the status quo? So letting love quiet fear with people from various ethnicities, various religious backgrounds, various gender identities, showing a piece of humility and standing together in this awareness that the only thing that can, like, anger cannot quiet fear. Anger is actually, I believe, a close relative of fear. But love is fearless. And so we, with For Freedoms, have done over 700 billboards and worked with thousands of artists and hundreds of institutions to do exhibitions, town halls, and various kinds of public activations with the desire of putting critical discourse into political discourse through fine art thinking. And Tenzin's mother, Catherine Gund, is a great example of a person who understood where art and action could intersect, and has spent most of her life also continuing to weave those threads. And so what we are doing, I think, is very much in the legacy of people like her and my mother, and I'm sure many of your relatives and maybe some of you.
Talk to me about the relationship between how you define a politician and an artist. We were thinking about this earlier today. You actually co-joined those two ideas. Why?
Well, there is a College of Arts and Sciences here,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Where are the arts in that college? Many of our founding fathers, quote unquote, were both artists and scientists. And somehow over the course of the past 150 years, we detached the idea of, like, when they created this nation, and they had, I think, a very limited vision. for who was a person. But the Constitution was a collaborative, creative document of stating, like, these are the things that we think are important. These are how we can create a pathway, literally a roadway, design a pathway for people to exist in the society. And for some reason, I think we've edited it 26 times formally, maybe. Somebody knows that in here.
The Constitution?
Yes. It's 26 amendments, 27.
We'll find out by the end of
Google.
the talk.
But we have not wholesale reimagined it. And that is a lack of creative vision. Like, when can we actually, what is the 21st century creative collaboration that maybe builds off of the Constitution of 1776, but actually corrects all of the things that we're now more, like, they didn't even, like, most of what we know about the world, they didn't know then. And so I'm really kind of hoping that more politicians see themselves as creative thinkers who are designing through the laws that they write, who are designing our society. And when we say great art asks questions, that is the role of an artist, I believe, in our society. And great design answers them. Those are also creative people, but they're creative people who are trying to solve a problem. And so I wish more artists thought themselves as political operatives, and more political operatives saw themselves as artists.
I want to get around to speaking about the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial to Peace and Justice, but just to kind of wind our way up to this discussion, to think about the role of a lawyer as, in effect, an artist, to seed the train with a few thoughts. The late Congressman John Lewis, when he created his penultimate Selma to Montgomery March, asked me, to my complete surprise, to speak with him in front of all his congressional colleagues about the function of the arts, right, for creating and redefining our narratives of national belonging. He wanted to think through not just the compositional power of a civil rights photographer, many of whom he knew, and even roomed with, lived with during his period in SNCC, but the power of the arts writ large, including the work of public monuments, to reshape our own social messaging in the world. And that stayed with me. The U.S. attorneys, their annual conference, I then went back and gave a keynote about vision and justice for the same idea, to do with the importance of seeing law as a designing tactic, harnessing the power of the creative arts. But what you've hit upon, I think, speaks to the gravitas of the idea. Yes, it's about creativity, but we're really here speaking about the stakes of what's lost when we don't take care of who's tending to the moral imagination of a society. Right? This is the politician who can put forth a vision of a moral imagination is the leader. Right? That's what history shows us, in effect. Now, the moral imagination is required for undoing injustices of all kinds. And so we've seen examples of what Hank is describing with the work of the lawyer Brian Stevenson as a recent example. Right? This is a civil rights lawyer, extraordinary leader, who has transformed our understanding of the landscape of racial injustice and racial terror, the history of lynching, not through legal work alone or at all, but through the work of research, but put forward in the public realm through the arts. Put forward through this 2008, I think, created, that was the year, 18 National Memorial to Peace and Justice, of which Hank Willis Thomas is a significant part. So as you wind your way down this Capitol Line structure in Montgomery, you circuit out and see raise up. Here, though, you're seeing the over 4,000 men, women, and children's names, if they're known, or unknown if they're not, indicating those lives who we hadn't not yet honored, not yet been able to commemorate, and now can, right, through this Mass Design founded space. So when you received the call from Brian, can you tell us a bit about what you began to think about to do with the function of a politician or lawyer in connection to the arts for justice?
Yeah, so I must have met Brian in 2015, over the phone at least. And he was talking about wanting to make a monument or memorial to victims of lynching in the United States, and that they were building this database of people who were lynched. And they were actually thinking about more going to the sites of these lynchings and maybe even making like road signs and markers. That was more the kind of idea. And somewhere along the way, that changed. And by 2017, they were building this. And I started to realize that Brian is a lawyer and civil rights lawyer and activist, but he's also a conceptual artist. And that he is not only kind of, what I found so fascinating is that after practicing law on a very high level for almost 3 decades, he decided that he needed art because there were things that the courtroom could not that were boundless, that could not actually get to the heart of it, because there is very little love in the criminal legal system. And that through making this monument and acknowledging our ancestors, not focusing as much, even though it is not, no one gets off easy, but focusing on the humanity of those dehumanized rather than the inhumanity of the dehumanizers. But to do that in the heart of the Confederacy and one of the capitals of the Confederacy is pretty amazing creative work. That one of the largest tourist dollars, I mean, you know, most people who go to Montgomery are going there to learn now around lynching and mass incarceration and slavery, as well as Montgomery bus boycotts and other things. But what a creative feat! Yeah. Like, that's not something that you could write into law. To, you know, and to be steps away from the Montgomery Capitol building where Dr. King spoke after that long, arduous march from Selma. There is this whole world of the American experience that there's nothing like it outside of the U.S. Capitol in this the National Mall and the Statue of Liberty. I can't think of a man-made or person-made structure that actually invites us to reflect on our history in such a powerful way, and it's expanding. They just are opening a new park next month.
Yes, yes.
And so that's the kind of artist I believe we all should have. And I don't want to discredit people who I disagree with. I want to actually use them as reminders of how important it is that I also ask questions that challenge, not only because another thing I think is so important is that the work is never finished, right? So I'm not mad at the people 300 years ago who did what they thought was best, because in that 300 years, millions of people have created all that I have now. So what can the millions of us do, knowing how flawed we are, knowing how much work will always need to be done, that 300 years from now, there is a humanity that is grateful for us.
The work continues even in Montgomery, as heralded and iconic as this memorial is. He's created, as Hank just mentioned, the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park. It's just been unveiled. It's on the site of a former plantation, and he's commissioned artists such as Hank Willis Thomas alongside Gahende Wiley and many others to really offer, and we also spoke about this morning, a site to prompt reflection that, in effect, nothing else can other than the arts, right, about our history of racialized injustice.
Because you can't tell it. Like, you can only feel it.
Well, the history of this country is founded on the unspeakable. Truly. This tension between liberty and slavery, you literally can't formulate it in a sentence that's intelligible. You have to be able to access it through other means, right? And it creates, I mean, I've argued this, and we say argued in scholarship. I believe this. I believe that the second founding of the United States after the Civil War freighted upon artists an outsized role to play in democracy because of this unspeakable foundation. It really foisted upon an artist like Hank, who's willing to take up this charge, you know, to function in such a manner to allow us to see what has been unseen or what is deliberately disregarded, right? So that we can live in this country. And so I just have such enormous debt of thanks to my dear friend, Hank, for this extraordinary work that you do. And one of the central tenets of your practice is to get us to see the truth. You have an interactive project, I think is in our slideshow, the Truth Booth work, that I think this audience might like to hear a bit about, because it speaks so much to the role of the artist in a democracy and political life. Can you talk to us about this project and what?
Sure. Oh, there's a quote. I love quotes. I was walking through the campus and I saw the logo recently today, and it occurred to me with my limited Latin that it says, yes. And what is rarely asked when we speak about the truth is whose truth. And because all of us have our own truths. And what I learned through photography of my mom's work, for instance, that there is a truth that I was educated with, which was that black people in the 19th century didn't have education. They didn't have any liberties. They weren't smart. They didn't have desires other than to be quote unquote free. But when I started to see pictures and learned about my mom's work around black photographers in 1839 and even before, at the beginning of photography, at a time when in order to make a photograph, you had to be conscious, for one. When I say conscious, like conscious, you had to understand mechanics, you had to understand chemistry, you had to understand physics, and you also had to have a means to be able to apply those things and a willingness to apply that all to create something that would last 150 years before someone else even noticed it, really. And that, think about African Americans 3 decades before the abolition or the transformation of slavery into mass incarceration, to think about people of African descent making, that's a whole different truth. And it doesn't demolish or counter the truth that the greater masses of people of African descent were in bondage and dehumanized, but it does question what else was going on in their lives. I don't think their whole lives in every moment was how we understand it. I can only vaguely connect to it in thinking about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where it's, pardon my language, it was really messed up. And the way that he talks about people surviving inhumanity through, and the good and the bad, none of the good people survived. It was one of the things that he kind of talks about. And so I'm imagining what is the inner life of a person who knows that their child is going to be sold away? You know, what is the inner life of a person whose father is bearing children with them and then going to sell their child? And sorry, feel like I'm going somewhere, but these truths that are really powerful for me to reimagine, but they're also I don't know. I just go there. So the Truth Booth is kind of an opportunity for me to contend with my truth, because I don't think I need to get rid of your truth for my truth to be also valid. And the more of us that can embrace the multitude of truths, is the closer we can get to the truth, which is that, in my opinion, they all matter and they all can change. But there was a quote. Oh, yeah.
The quote.
I do this on my phone.
Maybe go to the next one.
So we traveled that to 35 states in South Africa and Ireland and Mexico. And what happens is people go inside the Truth Booth and they share, they start with this phrase, the truth is, and then they share whatever is true for them. And I've gotten the benefit of seeing 10,000 of these videos. And recognizing that I don't have to have my ego involved if someone is sharing, being vulnerable to share their truth. So there's a quote in 1984 by George Orwell that really, I think, speaks to this moment, but speaks to the truth. But he says, whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. And I think the truth of the past is what's in contention. You know, so whoever controls the truth of the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. So that, was talking to Sarah about social media companies and Getty Images picture agencies, archives, and those corporations own the present, which will soon become the past. And what is maintained is going to be control the future. And so people like my mother, people like Sarah, and people like many of you who time travel, who go into these archives, into the past. That's why I love librarians, because they're timekeeper. They're like, if it's a science fiction movie, they're like be the person who's like allowing you to go into this portal and like, where do you want to go? They shoot you there, and of course you can't see everything, but no one can see everything in that world. So, but seeing little pieces of that is so powerful. But I am so nervous about what happens when major corporations or governments. There's a company called the Visual China Group, which owns the largest archive of images, and I wonder what that government might want to do with tens of millions of photographs and how that might change the future.
You know, I've never actually asked you this. This will be my last question before I open up for you. I'll give you some time to think through yours. But whether what you've just described about the sort of fragility or precarity of the social landscape to do with the images prompted a move into the public arena regarding monuments. Is there a connection between the two, or it just happen?
I'd love for you to make that connection.
Okay. We see an article.
Because that would be the truth.
That would be the truth. Okay.
Because I can't see my truth. That's a major important thing about an artist. Being an artist is that I have my truth. Like, and some of you who might have read or seen articles or stories about the Embrace, it was a really amazing opportunity for me to witness the multitude of truths. There was the truth of the thousands of people who were there that day, and all of the kind of news and press that was happening, and then the truth that was online as a result of, I think, a really well propped image, and how in the moment where people were making these suggestions and people were calling me like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Okay, what? Am I supposed to feel bad because somebody on the internet saw something that is meant to be experienced?" But that my truth was like, the truth in that case that came to me was the only thing that people could relate my sculpture to were the Statue of Liberty and the Washington Monument, and then the Eiffel Tower. I was like, because people hated all those things when they were created, and so it gave me a clear understanding of how the truth changes. But also, more close to your point, when I love sculptures of men on horses. I just do. But most of those men also have swords and or guns. And my mom, my grandmother were not those people, right? And I think that there is enough room for men on horses and people who would never climb a horse or kill someone. And so that was my interest in a lot of my work, is how do we start to embody the spirit of love and community in public space.
Part of how you've done that is taken that sword and, as an artist, transformed it into a knife to kind of slice out what shouldn't be seen and to give us better access to what should. And this is something I have written about. So that narrative I've already put out as the truth about Hank's work. But it's really one of, I think, the extraordinary formal tactics that you've used to shift our gaze and to allow us to focus. That the cropping of the photograph of the kings that creates the monument, is an act of that transformation, right?
You made me think of a cake. It's like a knife that cut a, it's like a MLK birthday cake, like happy birthday to you.
Are we going to make that now?
I mean, I was like, that's like, I want my work to be delicious.
Well, it is. It is.
I wanted you to feel like, because there's something sweet about it,
Yes,
something like,
right.
oh.
That's right.
And I hope it can be not sweet without being too sweet. It's that nurturing sweet that I think we deserve more in life.
Yeah. Well, there's much more to come from his extraordinary mind and heart and practice. I want to make sure you have ample time for questions. So if we have any, I know there might be mics, and if not, you can speak. Please ask them now, yes.
Rick Mayhew just turned 100 this past week, April 3rd, and is still working and vibrant. I was just wondering about your influences. Dana King had her second career and now is a renowned sculptor and is part of the monument where she's sculpted kind of an interactive vignette of Black women that you can stand in their,
Footprints.
yes, which is wonderful. So, kind of your truth booth reminded me of that kind of interactive art, right? Where regular people are coming in and, oh, I can see myself as an artist too. What am I doing here? So I was wondering what your influences are.
My influences are, I don't mean to be smug, I feel like air.
This is why I didn't ask the question of the influences, because this is what I knew you'd say, air and life.
And awareness.
Yeah, it's true.
And
It's true.
I get, because the more I breathe, the more I have opportunities to be inspired by other people. There is, Nasha Lindo was an artist, I would say mentor of mine, was a dear friend, is a dear friend, and was mentored by Richard Mayhew. But I just see those connections everywhere, so I'm definitely, I do want to point out Tenzin again. I heard him sing for the first time, I think, 10 years ago. And because I grew up in a similar kind of scenario where there's a bunch of other people who are older than me always stopping by my house, the grace in which you have kind of embodied your identity, your life is something, because they're asking about she was asking about where I get inspiration. And young people who are creating their own world, charting their own path, are inspiring to me, because it gives me, who's now getting older, an opportunity to be like, oh, I can open up also. I don't need to just look at people who are older to be my inspirations. So the more I breathe, I'm like, oh, my daughter's 5, and she's asking questions and saying things, and I'm like, oh, okay, my world does not have to be like this, and that's like, even when she says simple things like, you don't have to have a husband. Until she said to someone who, she's like, are you married? She's like, no. She's like, well, some people just don't need husbands. And
Man is not a plan.
yeah, but for a 5-year-old to say that, even with the social conditioning that I have with, was really kind of fascinating, because I hope that in her world, her fulfillment doesn't come from, she understands already the association that comes with, like, oh, you are supposed to have a partner, but also you don't necessarily need to. So I hope that is a weird artist answer to your question.
I'm glad you asked it. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I became familiar with your work a few years ago and have immersed myself a little bit into it because I was doing some research on the power of art to inspire young people to become politically active and engaged. And I learned about some of the work that I think For Freedoms was doing and other kinds of programs that you've been doing with young people, groups of young people, to empower them through art, and also to politicize young artists themselves and to see their own work as being political. And so I wanted to hear more about that work that you do.
Well, I believe all art is political, if only because often outlives, like most of what we know about ancient Egypt is through the art that was left behind. Most of what people know about 17th century Europe is through the art. And it's because and that's when I was talking about Frederick Douglass's long, like he's still alive through the art. And those people, he wasn't defined as an artist. He might now, today, be classified as a performance artist. And I have done my best to show that, like, even a picture of the color blue has a political value, because to say that it's not important is political, right? To say that there is no meaning in a person meditating on a color is a political value statement. And as we need, as a collective species, we need some of us to delve into the subconscious. And otherwise, we run the risk of just simply creating propaganda. And there's a fine line between art that is dictating and art that is inviting. And so I always encourage myself and others to, so with a project of Writing on the Wall, people who are incarcerated, some of them saw themselves as artists, some who didn't, just presenting their work as their writing as an artwork, for me, is a political statement, because they are now artists. And so I firmly believe the more of us that call ourselves artists, the better off we will be politically and spiritually. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I'm just thinking about how you can sort of inculcate that empowerment and understanding of art with young people who are artists or consumers of art.
What if I told you I'm more interested in inculcating that into old people who have no interest in art?
Okay.
I mean, look at our two presidential candidates.
Yeah.
Like, I wish while one of them is very creative, I wish his mind would be more expansive. And the other one who's less creative, I wish he really embraced his creativity. And I wish the rest of us who are not running for president imagined ourselves as being able to create a better world through our action. And so I really, that's honestly who I am most invested in. Like the people like me who think I deserve to sit on the sideline, and that's how I can support society. I want to model the courage to be wrong, to fail, to try again, up until my 80s, 90s, and 100s, so that people who are 7 and 10 and 20 and 25 are like, okay, I don't have to get it right and be righteous, self-right. I want to be righteous, not self-righteous.
Yes.
And that's what I encourage, because so much at times I feel like people want to dictate for others, and it's just like, just come in and play, and like stay in that state of play.
Yeah.
I hope that wasn't disappointing.
No,
That's the truth.
I think
Yes.
we might have a question in the back. Is that right? Yes, yes.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to hear you speak today here and in Professor Willis's class, and I was wondering, you create such kind of intensely, profoundly public art pieces that will be viewed by kind of so many people, kind of both consciously, kind of intentionally seek out your work, and those who kind of come across it as they're sort of in the world. Do you ever sort of find yourself worrying, or rather, how do you make peace with the fact that you kind of can't control what people take away from what you create? You have these really like personal and political goals for it, but how do you kind of live with the fact that people will see it, interpret it in their own way, I suppose?
I'm going to give another disappointing answer. I relate that more to, I see that as aligned with why I can't do 20 sit-ups every day. I want to do 20 sit-ups every day. I can imagine the value of that, but I cannot create that reality. All right. So like when like with the Embrace, there are 1,000 people who worked on that project. Not just that, some of them were paper pushers, some of them are politicians, some of them donated money, some of them voted on it, some of them were welders, some of them were people who cast things, somebody drove it. All of those people were part of the making of the work. I don't really believe in the individual auteur because someone's always providing space. Even Paul English and Damon Martin, who were the people who were imagining this, Dr. King and Mrs. King, least of all, are their parents. like this is just, I am just a portal for the magic of the world to manifest itself. And that is an honor. So I do truly believe that people like AWOL or Dr. Lewis, we are, and I mentioned this earlier, that we're conjurers. We are like, we don't really have space in our society to talk about magic, wizardry, or witchcraft. But at another time, we might be seen as seers. I know you know this, Del. And even also educators, right? Because you are literally impressing, like you're making an imprint. If you're on someone else's, molding someone else's world, that is an art form. And you can hope that the impression you want to leave on them is what you want, but you also must acknowledge that is, whatever the form is what it is. Some things are more malleable than others, and accepting it is the best way to work with it.
Wonderful.
I did 5 setups today, though.
Bravo.
Well, you know, at the end of that speech Frederick Douglass gave, as you know, he says it might take over 150 years for someone to come along and better explain what he means about the importance of representation and the arts for justice. And I think we know
That he was
an
talking to you.
artist know that he had in mind. And we know all the scholars like your mother who he hoped would come. So we're really living in, as you say, this ongoing path in which we are in this relay race of, I think, scholars and artists passing along this torch, ever increasing our understanding of the critical role that artists play in politics, in representational democracy. This talk has been titled Art Imitates Nation, but I think we understand why nation needs to, and at its best, imitates art. It shifts our moral imagination, gives us a sense of what actually leads us, reminds us that it's always that moral imagination. And so it's no surprise that we're here at the Kennedy School at the Institute of Politics speaking with one of the very artists, Frank Willis Thomas, who's leading us.
And I'm
along the
thankful
way.
to Dr. Khalil Muhammad for creating this opportunity for me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Okay. We don't want to leave you. Thank you.